George Harrison was many things to many people, a guitarist, a mystic, a quiet revolutionary. But within the walls of the most famous band in history, he was something else entirely, a man perpetually underestimated, quietly seething, and endlessly searching for the recognition he believed he had earned. The story of his inner life, his frustrations, and his complicated relationships with his bandmates is one that has never received quite the attention it deserves, overshadowed always by the louder, more theatrical rivalry between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. He was born on February 25, 1943, the youngest of 4 children raised by Harold and Louise Harrison in a modest terrace house at 12 Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool. The house was humble by any standard, no indoor toilet, heating from a single coal fire. But it was filled with warmth, largely because of his mother Louise, a woman of Irish Catholic descent who possessed an unshakable belief in her children's happiness. She was the first person to truly nurture George's musical instincts, recognizing his passion not as a distraction but as something essential to who he was. During her pregnancy with George, she had frequently tuned into Radio India broadcasts, captivated by the sounds of sitars and tablas, hoping the music would bring peace to her unborn child. Whether by coincidence or something more mysterious, that same music would one day define her son's artistic identity. The family moved to a council house in Speke in 1949, and George enrolled at Dovedale Primary School before passing his 11+ exam and attending Liverpool Institute High School for boys. He found little inspiration there. The school offered a music course but no guitars, and the rigid academic environment felt suffocating to a boy whose entire inner world was organized around sound and rhythm. He doodled guitars in the margins of his school books and told people plainly that he was completely consumed by the instrument. His early influences ranged widely. Carl Perkins, Lonnie Donegan, Django Reinhardt, and Hoagy Carmichael all left their marks. But it was a moment in early 1956 that changed everything. Riding his bicycle through the neighborhood, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel floating from a nearby house, and something locked into place inside him that never came undone. Around the age of 14, his mother paid £3.10 for his first guitar, a sum that adjusted for inflation amounts to roughly £110 today, but in terms of its impact on popular music is essentially priceless. A family friend taught him foundational songs, and George practiced with a dedication that left little room for much else. He formed a skiffle group called the Rebels with his brother Peter and a friend, and it was through those early musical adventures that he found himself on a school bus one day sitting beside Paul McCartney. The two bonded immediately over their shared obsession with music, rehearsing chord shapes together and feeding each other's ambitions in the way that only two young people with the same dream can. In March 1958, George auditioned for the Quarrymen, the skiffle group led by John Lennon and McCartney. Lennon was skeptical at first, thinking the 15-year-old was simply too young. McCartney arranged a second chance, this time on a Liverpool bus, and George played the lead guitar part of Raunchy with enough precision and confidence to win Lennon over. He was brought into the fold gradually and eventually became a full member, leaving school at 16 despite his father's wishes and committing himself entirely to music. Their residences at clubs in Hamburg in 1960 were formative and grueling, the band playing for hours each night to noisy, demanding audiences. Harisson, still underage, was deported midway through for being unable to legally work in nightclubs, an early reminder that the rules of the world did not always accommodate his ambitions. Brian Epstein took over as their manager by late 1961, refining their image and securing them a recording contract with EMI. Love Me Do charted modestly, but Please Please Me launched them into a level of fame that no one could have fully anticipated. Beatlemania swept the globe, and Harisson, reserved and watchful by nature, earned the nickname the Quiet Beatle, a label the press attached to him and one he accepted with quiet amusement. He had 2 lead vocal credits on the debut album, and his first solo writing credit, Don't Bother Me, appeared on their second record. Slowly, methodically, he was building something. But the pace at which his contributions were being recognized within the band was a different matter entirely. His musical evolution through the mid-60s was remarkable by any measure. On Rubber Soul in 1965, he introduced the sitar to Western pop music through Norwegian Wood, earning praise from ethnomusicologists for the cultural sensitivity of his approach. By Revolver in 1966, he had opened the album with the sharp, politically charged taxman and contributed the Indian-influenced Love You To, earning himself the nickname the Maharaja of Raga Rock. His composition Within You Without You on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967 reflected a deepening spiritual commitment that was becoming inseparable from his identity as an artist. He later described Rubber Soul as his favorite Beatles album and had complicated, ambivalent feelings about Sgt. Pepper, seeing it as both a landmark and a weight the music industry would carry in ways not always healthy. But even as his artistry expanded, the internal politics of the Beatles remained stubbornly unchanged. Harrison was allowed 2 or 3 songs per album at most, while Lennon and McCartney filled the rest of the space with their own output. His compositions were treated as secondary, an afterthought slotted in around the real business of the record. The frustration this caused him was not merely professional, it was personal, rooted in years of feeling invisible within a group he had helped build from its earliest days. The Let It Be sessions at Twickenham Studios in early 1969 brought things to a breaking point. Fed up with the atmosphere and the interpersonal dynamics, Harrison walked out on January 10, 1969. He returned 12 days later after the band agreed to move to Apple Studio, but the damage to his patience and sense of belonging had been done. His relationship with Paul McCartney was the most layered and emotionally exhausting of all his Beatles relationships. They had known each other the longest, had learned guitar together as teenagers, and McCartney had stood beside him as best man at his 1966 wedding to Pattie Boyd. McCartney called George his baby brother and clearly felt a genuine familial affection for him. But in the studio, McCartney's perfectionism and his instinct to control arrangements and dominate the creative process left Harrison feeling perpetually squeezed out. Harrison was particularly vocal about the recording of Maxwell's Silver Hammer in 1969, describing McCartney's approach as selfish and exhausting, noting how McCartney expected full engagement on his own songs while giving considerably less energy and enthusiasm to Harrison's work. In a 1974 interview, Harrison said plainly that he would rather have Willie Weeks on bass than McCartney, not out of personal animosity but because he found McCartney musically overpowering. In a BBC radio interview that same year, he went further still, claiming that McCartney had ruined him as a guitar player, a statement carrying decades of compressed resentment. By Abbey Road in 1969, Harrison finally broke through in a way that silenced even his most stubborn critics. Here Comes the Sun and Something were not just highlights of the record. They were among the finest songs the Beatles ever released as a group. Frank Sinatra called Something the greatest love song of the past 50 years. John Lennon declared it the best track on the album. It topped charts in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and West Germany, and both sides of its double-A-side single reached #1 in the United States. Harrison had proven conclusively what he had always known about himself. McCartney only publicly acknowledged the full extent of Harrison's talent decades later, telling Howard Stern in 2020 that George had been a late bloomer but that when he bloomed, he wrote some of the greatest songs ever written. Though the Harrison-McCartney tension dominated much of the band's internal story, Harrison's most unhealed wound may have actually been his relationship with Lennon. Lennon mocked his spiritual pursuits, dismissed his devotion to Indian music, and rarely took his songwriting seriously during the Beatles' years. Their interactions in the band's final period were often cold and emotionally remote. Harrison later described Lennon as difficult and self-centered, and in his memoir I, Me, Mine, he barely mentioned Lennon at all, a pointed absence that communicated more than any direct accusation could have. He grieved Lennon's death in 1980 but never softened his private assessments of the pain that relationship had caused him. George Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1998 and by 2001 was fighting both lung cancer and a brain tumor. Paul McCartney visited him approximately 10 days before his death at a treatment facility outside New York. By McCartney's own account, the two men held hands, told jokes, and sat together in a kind of peace that had taken them 40 years to reach. Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at 58 years old. McCartney told reporters the next day that George had been a lovely, brave man with a wonderful sense of humor, his baby brother to the very end. Their children, Stella McCartney and Dhani Harrison, have since built a warm friendship of their own, a living reminder that beneath all